Daniel here, back again with the Virtual Robotics Studio, and guess what? It is time. We have gotten the dimensions from the Everybot team out of Texas, the Robonauts. So we are going to start our chassis assembly, and in order to do that, you are going to need your AM14U5 box. This has all of the kit-apart chassis components that we're going to need, and the only other parts we need for this build are the sim motors. So we're going to need 4 of these sim motors. I think they came from AndyMark, but they've got sim motor on them, 2.5 inch, 12 volt DC. Get 4 of those. All right, as for tools that we need, we're going to do our best to call out the specific parts and tools that you need for each of kind of the sub-steps of this build. But if you want to get everything together at once to be ready to go, this is what you'll need. All right, you're going to need a 5/32 Allen wrench. You can either use the angle kind or a handled one. The handled one's usually a little bit faster, so I'm going to use that mostly today. We also need some wrenches. You'll need a 9/16 wrench and a 9/16 socket. If you don't have the socket, you can get a second 9/16 wrench or an adjustable wrench if you have to. We're also going to need a 1/2 inch wrench and a 3/8 inch wrench. You can also use a 3/8 socket. Sometimes that's a little bit faster. We need a 1/4 inch socket to help screw stuff in for our wheels. You could use a flathead screwdriver for that, so I've got that out here. But the socket is so much better. I cannot recommend enough that you get a 1/4 inch socket for that. Our last socket is 7/16. This one we're actually not using to tighten stuff. We're going to use it to help us hit stuff into place. So if you don't have exactly a 7/16, a little bit smaller should still work. A little bit bigger I think works as well. All right, we're going to have to measure and cut our chassis down, so we've got our tape measure. After we make our cuts, we're going to have some sharp edges, so we've got a file to clean that up, a Sharpie to help us mark the parts. Some of the cuts, it's going to be easier to mark and get a precise cut if you have a set of calipers, digital or otherwise. And we might also need a hammer to persuade stuff getting it into place. But in this case, we really want a soft-ended hammer. So find something with rubber ends or plastic ends, not metal if you can. We may need, but it's not required, a builder square and a pair of pliers. And then if you do have a drill that you can use to attach that socket to, that 1/4 inch socket to, or some of the other sockets to, that's going to save you a lot of time in assembly. And then we'll be using some machine tools, so I've got my safety glasses. All right, a quick note before we move on. There are a few of the steps of this video that can be done simultaneously. So if you have enough tools and you have a big enough team, we recommend that you do the first part, which is cutting the chassis down to size, and have some of your group also work on assembling the wheels, which I think is the second part of this video. All right, that's it. Let's get this cleared off and start building. All right, let's get into this kit. So let's open it up and take a look at what we got inside. So the first thing is there is an instruction manual. This works, but only if you are building the kit to the size, one of the 3 sizes that AndyMark has by default. The Everybot that we're building this year is not one of those sizes, and we're going to assemble things in a little bit of a different order. So we're not going to need that for this video. We've got our wheels. We're going to set those aside for later. You should also have 2 bags of transmission components. These are going to start with kind of this black plastic housing, and it'll say Tough Box on it. And those, we don't need them quite yet. There should be another giant bag. This is all of our wheel pulleys that we're going to have to assemble. So go ahead and set those with your wheels. We're going to build all of that together in a bit. And there's a bunch of different belts in here. And we'll remind you later, but we actually only need 1 of these sizes of belts. So we're going to use 4 of them. There are 12 different sizes. But the pieces we need right now are the metal frame pieces. So there are 2 of these. These are the inner frame pieces. And we've got 2 of these ones, which are the outer frame pieces. And these are just C-channels, short C-channels, where the top leg is the same height on both. And it looks like inside my C-channels, I have, these are called churro pieces because I guess they look like churros. But we're going to need those to assemble as well. We're going to have to cut those down as well. And then finally, we have these big uneven C-channels where one side is longer than the other. And these are going to be the front and back of the robot. So we will need both of those to get marked up and cut. And then there's a bunch of hardware inside those C-channel pieces, some bearings, some screws, and stuff like that. We are going to need all of that, but not for this step where we just need to cut our frame down to size. So I'm going to move everything but the metal pieces out of here. We'll mark those up and get them cut. Before we start marking and cutting them, I do want to remind you, of course, that once you cut it, you can't go back. So make extra sure you have it marked at the right dimension before you take it over to the saw. All right, the first piece we're looking at is the big C-channel piece, right, where we have one long side, one short side. And this piece, I think, starts out at something like 30 inches. So this piece is pretty long. Yeah, oh, it's 31 inches right now. We need this piece to be 22 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and use my tape measure, and we're going to mark 22 inches on this. One of the things you want to try to do when you're marking stuff with the tape measure, make sure your tape measure is not on a huge angle like this. Make sure it's nice and straight. And we'll just go right over to 22, and I'll make a little mark. And you want to kind of make sure that the edge of the mark is on the line. Sometimes people even do a little like check mark. And I know the end of that point is where I want my cut line to be. And if you have the square that we've been using, I can now bring that square over right until it lines up with the edge of my mark. And I'm just going to draw that line all the way across. So for this cut, it's not too bad if you're a little bit short or a little bit long. And by a little bit, I mean, if my line were actually over here or over here, both of those are still going to go together, and your frame is still going to work, but try to be as accurate as you can. And we need to do this for both of our front and back pieces, our big angled C-channel pieces. So we'll do it again, same process, line it up, come out to the 22, and get a little mark so I know the point of that is my 22. Bring in my square, and mark it. All right, so these two pieces are marked. What we're actually going to do is we'll mark all of the pieces, and then we'll cut all of the pieces. Sometimes it helps too to remember. In this case, it's pretty easy, but we know this is the scrap side. So sometimes I put a little X on the scrap side. All right, let's move these two off to the side. Let's put them back over here. Next piece that we're looking at. I call these the inside frame rails. These are kind of weird pieces, right? So they've got an angle going one direction on one side, and it's pointing the other direction on the other side. But you can tell it's the right piece because it has this really weird cutout shape here in the middle. And this shape is to match our transmissions later. Let's think about how we're going to cut this. So I can slide this through the bandsaw kind of this way. That seems good. So we'll mark it on this side so we can see what we're doing. I think it's pretty much the same if you mark it on this side. Yeah, so either way, we're going to be OK. Now, this piece is a little bit different. We took all of the extra length off of our first piece from one side. On this one, though, we're going to have to take a little bit off of both sides. So right now, this piece is 32 inches long. We need it to be 28 inches long. And so that means we need to lose 4 inches or 2 inches per side. So in this case, we're doing a short distance. And so if you have the square, it's even nicer because we have some of those marks on it. Of course, you can do the same thing with the tape measure. Get your mark at 2, and then do your best to transfer that mark over. But I think what I can do right now is, with the square here, I've actually got lines at 1 and 2 inches. And I can actually slide this along the edge of the piece. And if I put my Sharpie right into that number 2 spot and slide it down, I will actually get a line pretty much right where we need it to be. Now that line ended up a little bit not so clear. So I will come back, and it looks like where we want this line to actually be is right in the middle of those holes that are here. Okay. That's what we're looking at on this side. And on this side, we're going to do the same thing. All right, and once again, we'll trace that all the way along. Okay, and for this piece, there's actually something else we can do to make an even more precise cut, but that will require one other tool. So if you have a set of digital calipers, I think these are actually pretty cheap. Not this specific one, I spent too much on mine, but There is a pretty cheap version that you can get from Harbor Freight. They're like 10, 15 bucks, and they work just about as good. What you can do with these is, we know the line needs to be somewhere in here, but you can see when I was marking this up, for some reason on this aluminum, I got a pretty clean line out of it. But on this aluminum, it really just sort of soaked in, and I don't really know where on that giant Sharpie line I'm supposed to cut. Now, I could go and I could just aim kind of for the middle of that and cut it, and it's going to work. You can have a decent amount of error on the length that you cut this piece to, and we're going to be okay. But what I can actually do is if I take my calipers and I open them up to 2 inches, because that's how much we wanted to cut off the edge. So if I set it to 2 inches, I can lock them in place. And by the way, that last digit doesn't matter. If you're 2.005, it's still good. All right, but these are actually sharp enough and hard enough to scratch into the aluminum that's here. So if I run this along the edge like that, what I'm actually doing is scribing a line into the aluminum. And so you can see now, hopefully you can see now, there is a little scratched line here in the middle. And I know I can aim for that line. And sometimes if you can't see that line, actually what we do is have you draw with a Sharpie and then scratch the Sharpie off. So it should contrast pretty well there. And we have that marked on one side. We have to do the same thing on the other side. So I'll come over here to the other side, line it up, and we'll just scratch that line in on this side. So now I have a scribed line on both sides. I know where to cut on this piece. We got to do the same thing for our second one, because we're going to have a left and a right side of our robot. And this time, I think I'll just scribe the line and see if it shows up well enough, because that'll save us a little bit of time. So we will go ahead and scratch down here. That's maybe, I can kind of see it if I tilt it the right way, but maybe we do want to draw a line with the Sharpie first so we can scratch it away and see it better. So it's going to be somewhere in this neighborhood. Yeah, this is weird aluminum. I don't know why it soaks in like that. But there we go. We can really see where that one is. Let's do the same thing on this side. And you don't even necessarily need the square. We know it's somewhere in this area, so I could just, really color it in a lot. And then when we come back and scribe this line, we'll scratch away what we need to scratch away. So hopefully you can see those on the camera. They're pretty visible to me here, so that looks good. So that's those 2 pieces done. We've got a few more pieces to mark. So next up, we are bringing out our C-channels. These are the outside frame members. All right, so they got a bunch of holes, some slots and stuff, but they have the even legs on their channels. They're sticking up the same amount on both sides. All right, and for this one, we could do the same thing again, right? These 2 pieces match. These 2 pieces need to be the same length and made the same way. So we're going to, again, have to cut 2 inches off of each end of these. So they started out the same dimension here, which was 32. We need them to be 28. So we're going to take 2 inches off this side and 2 inches off this side. And once again, I think depending on what kind of saw we're using, it's a little bit better to try to cut this way into the saw blade. So if we can mark on the inside here, it's going to be nice. So again, same process. If you only have the tape measure and stuff, you can do the tape measure and try to mark a line there. I'll go ahead and do our Sharpie and caliper trick again. So once again, I think if you look, right, the hole we're going to cut, or the cut we're going to make, is going to go just about through the center of these 2 holes that are right here. So I know the line I'm going to scribe needs to be somewhere right around there. Might as well color in the other side too while we're at it. All right. And my calipers are still at 2 inches, so I don't have to change anything. I just come in here and scratch that line in. And when you're doing this, you don't have to push really hard. If you just kind of gently drag it across, you get enough of a scratch there that you can see where your cut line is supposed to be. So that's one side. Let's get the other side. There we go. That one's looking good. And of course, if we do it on, say this is for the left side of our robot, we got to do the same thing for the right side of our robot. So one more time, color this in with the Sharpie. and let's scratch some lines. All right, that looks good. Set those aside. All right, and the last piece that we have to cut. So these, I call these churros in the opening to this video, I guess because of the shape. But these are going to be cross support. So these are going to go across the inside of our robot to help keep the two sides of the robot strong and sturdy with each other. So this piece needs to get cut down from, I don't know, this is long. I think it's 24 and something inches. We need it to be 13.25 inches. So that is bigger than the digital calipers can do. So we are back to tape measure and Sharpie. So we're looking for 13.25, 13.25 inches. So 13.25 right here. All right, so I think it's the inside of that mark I made. And I'm going to, it's probably not super necessary in this case, but I will go ahead and just clean those lines, bold those lines up a little bit so I can really see them when I'm cutting it. Now on this piece, remember I put the X over here saying this was going to be our scrap. On this piece, those are pretty close in length together, so I don't want to get them mixed up. So again, the piece we want is this side, which is 13.25. Our waist piece now is going to be like 11-ish. But I am going to put a couple marks on here just so I know this is not the side that I want. It's pretty hard to draw an X though, so we'll just settle for some whatever those are. All right, and we've got to do that also twice. So once again, mark it at 13.25. That looks pretty good. All right, that is all of our, oh wait, yep. And then I'm going to mark this side is the side I don't want a few times. All right, perfect. Okay, now we have everything marked. It's time to head over to the saw and start cutting them. All right, there are, of course, lots of different ways to cut metal. We're going to start out with our little mini bandsaw here, tabletop bandsaw. We got this one from Harbor Freight. It was, I think, just over $100. So it's not a huge investment if you can get one. And we'll go ahead and make a couple cuts on this, and then we'll talk about some of the other saws that you could use to do the same thing. And it looks like on this bandsaw, it just barely is big enough to make this cut. If this were too long and I couldn't get it to fit here, if the neck was too narrow, you'd have to make one cut just to get clearance and then one more cut. But we'll try to get right on that line right from the beginning. All right. Let's see, we can probably adjust this down a little bit. Yeah, it looks good. Let's go for it. All right, one down. And let's go ahead and do this piece too on this bandsaw. And of course, the other side. All right, those two look pretty good. Let's go ahead and use a different saw for some of the other cuts, just so that if you have a different set of machinery in your shop, we kind of give you an example for all the options you have. Okay, so as you just saw, of course, if you have even a tiny, that's called a vertical bandsaw, you can make all of the cuts you need to make for this chassis adjustment. But there are some other options. There actually is a machine called a horizontal bandsaw, where you actually clamp the piece in, and then the bandsaw blade will lower down and make the cut. Those are great if you can get one of them. If you can't, if you have like a handheld saw with a metal blade, these will work. It's harder to be accurate with a cut with something like this, or a jigsaw, which looks a little bit different, but it's still a handheld saw. Your last plan, if you absolutely have to, you could just get a hacksaw and do it. Again, you just got to go really slow and be really careful with the hacksaw, because there's a good chance it's not going to stay right on your line. So with the hacksaw, or even with the handheld saws, if you're not sure if you can cut perfectly on the line, if you cut a little bit off the line, you can go back and kind of file or sand that down until it's exactly the right length. But again, with these pieces, you can be a little bit long or a little bit short, and it's still going to work. So let me set these down. The other option, which is great if you can get it, this one that I have is a little bit more expensive, but there is a version of this. I think it's the Evolution Rage Saw. So these look like, and we've used these to cut wood before, and they will, but this is actually called a cold saw, and it is for cutting metal. So it has a metal cutting blade in it. Do not use one of these that is a miter saw for wood, for metal. The blade spins way too fast. It's actually very, very dangerous. But if you get the ones that are designed for metal, I think most of the major companies make one, but also, yeah, Evolution Rage, I think, has one that's around $200. So it's a little bit more expensive than the bandsaw we just used, but not that much more. So if you have some extra funds, that's something to look into. But these are great, because just like when you're cutting wood with them, you can get a nice, clean, straight cut on them, and it goes a little bit faster than the bandsaw. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up all of my cuts using this saw, just to save a little bit of time. All right. And the other thing with these ones that are designed for metal is they do have this built-in clamp, right? So I'm going to be able to clamp the piece in, and my hands aren't going to be anywhere near the danger zone. All right, so let's get this lined up. And if you are using a saw like this, remember, this is my scrap side. So I want the blade to take the line out, but leave everything on this side of the line, on the good side of the line. So I'm going to line up the inside of the blade there. Looks pretty close. Again, we have a pretty good margin for error here. Let me get that clamped up. And let's see, this wants to be clamped up straight, so we'll let it do what it wants. All right, away we go. All right, one down, pretty straight cut. And I guess let's just crank through them, although this saw does make more of a mess than the other one. All right, next up, our inside frame rail here. Looks good. And then remember, we did 2 inches off one side. We did 2 inches off one side, so I got to flip it around and get 2 inches off the other side as well. All right, that one looks good, and we can check kind of with the one we did before. They are pretty much exactly the same length, so that's going to work out great. Same thing on these two. Oh yeah, that'll do. My bandsaw one, actually, I don't know if you can see it, but it's on a little bit of an angle, so there's a little bit of a bump out there. So I didn't make a perfect cut on my first one. But again, it is more than good enough for what we need. It's going to work just fine. All right, let's go through our last two here. We've got our outside frame channel pieces. Actually, what I'm seeing is it's pretty hard for me to see where this blade is hitting. So I'm going to go ahead and add, I'm going to get my calipers, I'm going to add one more scratch line right on top of here so I can really line that blade up. So we are back to 2 inches on these, because that is the length of the cut. Actually, I'm at 1.9995, which is probably close enough. All right, and if I just scribe a line here, that line now is closer to where I think I can see with the saw blade where it's going to hit. So I can line up a little bit more precisely. All right, that looks like I got it. I'll move these a little bit so they don't get the shower of aluminum on them. And away we go. Okay. Something to keep in mind when you're working on this is as these chips build up here, it can actually make it so that when I put the piece in, it doesn't sit down flat. And I think this one didn't feel good, so we want to kind of clean that up. Don't wipe on this with your hand. Those are sharp bits of metal. So either get a glove or a rag to wipe it off. So I've got some of these shop rags, and I can go in there and also a brush works really well, like a paintbrush. You can go in there and get it cleaned up nicely. All right, that looks good. Let's continue the cutting. And again, for this one, I just need to add that extra mark just so I can get it lined up with the way I'm cutting it. Clamp it in. All right, the other outside panel. And another little 2-inch mark. And the last one. All right. And finally, we have those churro pieces that we've got to cut. So same deal. Just line up our cut mark. And let's go. And the last cut. Okay, couple things. All of the pieces that we aren't using, save those. Some of them we might want to use later, but these are also good brackets that you can use if you start designing your own parts in the future. So all of these cutoff pieces, collect them together, find someplace safe to keep them, just in case you need them in the future. All right, but for all of our other pieces, we have another problem. They've all got kind of these sharp edges to them where our saws went through. And there are some rules in the competition. One rule is you cannot have sharp edges on your robot. So that's a safety thing for people that are checking out your robot or working on the robot. You don't want to have these like really sharp bits of metal that can catch and cut people. But also when you're playing on the field, if you got sharp edges all over your robot, they could, for example, pop the cubes and you'll get penalties for that. So we need to clean up all the edges of these pieces. We need to file them down or sand them down until they're nice and smooth. So that is going to be our next step. Okay, we talked about, especially if you're using one of the hand tools or a hacksaw to make the cut, if you cut a little bit past the line and you're like, wow, this is still a little bit too long, if you do have a sander or a grinder, you could come in here and take it down till it's exactly the right length. You can also try to use they usually come with one of these things that's a guide that helps you stay nice and square to everything, keep everything flat. But you could grind that down to take the edges off. But some of the edges we put on this piece is really hard to sand off on this one because we have these extra legs that are sticking out in funny ways. The churro piece you could probably sand on here, so let's give that a try. Just want to kind of get those edges a little bit. Yep, and that looks good. No more sharp edges. So I think this piece is good to go, but we gotta still clean up the rest of our parts. Okay, so our first churro is filed and we have nice and clean, no sharp edges on that. We've got all of the rest of the pieces still to go. And one of the ways to tell if it's good or not is if you gently run your finger along the edge of it, you should be able to feel a raised lip there. And that's called a burr. But if you think about it, that raised lip, even if it's not going to cut you, although sometimes they can be sharp, which is why I said gently run your finger along it, if there is extra material there, when we go to put these pieces together, right, that extra bit of metal could actually be causing this not to sit flat on the other piece, and that's going to make, so when we assemble our chassis, it could be out of shape. So we definitely want to clean up all of these edges. So if you take a hand file, one of the easiest ways to do this is you can go back and forth on it to try to break each section off individually. Most files actually only work when you push. Some will work in both directions, but usually just pushing does most of the work. And so if you just come along that edge at a little bit of an angle, so I'm at 30 degrees, probably not quite 45 degrees. And it doesn't have to be that exact, but all I do is just run along it like twice. And if I feel the edge now, there's nothing. It's completely clean. It's rounded over. Sometimes you want to do the same thing, but kind of on the other side of that corner. So once on this side of the corner, once on that side of the corner. But that is now nice and clean. So I got to work my way around the outside edges. So I'll do the same thing kind of on this short side here. Sometimes the end where it was cut, you need to kind of hit that and round around a little bit on it. And then I'll get this side on the outside as well. And I'll kind of round that corner just a little bit. All right, and then the reason why we couldn't use the grinder, well, first of all, we don't want to take too much off, which the grinding wheel might do, but getting the inside is almost impossible. But here, the inside is basically the same thing as the outside. So I'm just going to run it across here a couple times at the other angle, get the short sides. I'm just gently feeling to see, right, when that edge is gone. When the edge is gone, it feels nice and flat, I'm ready to move on. And that is it for that side. So that's one side down. What do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We got 6 pieces, so I got 11 sides left to go. Okay, and remember on these pieces, we only cut one side, so you can still check the other side to see if there's anything that's really bad. But mine feels good on the side that we got from Andy Mark. So we really just have to do one side. That saves us some time. That was really all I had. All right, our next step is to assemble all 6 of the wheels. Now, the center wheels are different. So we have 2 wheels that are going to be a little bit different, and we have 4 wheels that are going to be exactly the same. Well, the 2 wheels will be the same as each other, and the other 4 wheels will be the same. We need the bag of pulleys. We're also going to need this bag of bearings. These are going to go inside the wheels and let the wheels spin nice and freely. And then we need this bag of screws. All right, and these screws, again, if you look at the top of them, the head of them, right, there is a slot for a flathead screwdriver to go in to screw these in. That is a lot harder and slower than having a socket that fits on the outside to screw them in. So if you have the socket, I recommend that. If you don't, well, it's going to be just fun as you take your time getting it screwed in that way. All right, so let's open this bag up. And you'll notice in this bag, we have a bunch of these black pulley halves, and then these 2 these are aluminum hubs. The 2 aluminum hubs are going to be for our center wheels, so I'll set those over there to get them out of our way. And these plastic pieces here will make the timing pulleys for the wheels. If you look very closely on them, there is a raised edge on one of these holes, and then there is an indent on another hole. So to put 2 of these together, we have to take the raised edge on this one and line it up with the hole indent on the other one, and then the hole on this one will line up with the raised edge on that one. And so when you get them lined up correctly and put them together, if you look on the side, there is no gap. It fits nice and flat. If I tried to put 2 together and I didn't line that up, you'll be able to see on that side where I'm trying to push it together, there is a gap and they're not like locking in together or nesting in together. So watch for that. We need to get a set nice and flat like this. And then, let me move these things over. If you take one of your wheels, this will actually sit down, just rotate it, and you'll feel it at some point drop down onto the wheel. And that is where this is going to go. This is actually what all of the outside wheels are going to look like. But each of these 6 holes in the middle, just sort of like the lug nuts on a car, we're going to have to drop a bolt into each of these holes to hold it together. And that's what we're using these screws for. And what I like to do is this can still move back and forth a little bit. And we have to make sure it lines up with the holes here on the wheel itself. So I think you can kind of feel the hole and get it just barely in there by hand, so it's not really moving. But then get the socket and start going. Wait, that's loosening. There we go. Okay, and what I like to do is I like to get all 6 of them started. So I'm going to do a few turns for all 6 of them. And then we're going to tighten them in what we call a star pattern. So let me get these ones started so they don't fall out. Also, starting them all at the beginning ensures that all of the holes are lined up and we don't over-tighten the first one, blocking the other holes, because it could shift a little bit and the other holes might not line up. All right, so they're all started, and my goal is, and I think this is the same recommendation when you are replacing a spare tire in your car, so if you didn't know that, now you do. We're going to tighten one bolt, then we're going to go as kind of across from it, across from that one, across from that one, across from that one, across from that one. And we're basically going to do a triangle and then the other triangle. And the idea is if you tighten them by going around in a circle, it's harder to make sure that this pulley is sitting flat against the wheel. But if we do this star pattern, it should pull this side down, then it'll pull the opposite side down, and it should get it to sit nice and flat. So here we go. You can see too, I'll do one. I'll do one with the flathead screwdriver. I might need a bigger flathead screwdriver. It gets really hard to turn, and this is why I'm actually going to give up. I'm going to need an even bigger screwdriver than the one I've got. But it gets really hard to turn when you get down to that point. And so that's why grabbing on the outside with the socket is so much nicer. So definitely suggest getting a socket. That one is in all the way. And this is plastic. This is a metal screw going into plastic. So if you look on the side and it looks like it's nice and flat, you can kind of give it one more little tug, one more little like maybe eighth of a turn. But don't keep going. If you try to crank down on it, it is plastic. You can damage it. So get it flat, tighten it a little bit more, and then stop. So first one's done. I'm going to move over to one on the opposite side. And that one's done. Again, I'm going to jump over to another point kind of on the star here. Good. And then I just did this one, so I'm going to jump all the way across to the next bolt. And of course, if you have lots of people on your team and you have 2 sockets, you could be assembling 2 wheels at once. I only have 1 socket and 1 person today, so. All right, and then jump over to, it doesn't matter, either of the other 2 that are left. And finally, the last one. All right. So we have one of the outside wheels to the point where we are going to stop. We'll eventually put bearings in, but we'll do all of those at once. So we have to repeat this process 3 more times, so we have 4 outside wheels done. Now, I could do it all with the socket, but if you do have a drill, you can get these adapters that let you attach sockets to your drill. I will say you have to be a little bit more careful when you're doing it this way because, again, we talked about not going too hard at the very end to over-tighten it. But let me grab another pulley hub here. Again, I'm going to find the raised edges, put them opposite each other so it locks together. There we go. Drop that on the wheel. And I kind of still like to get a couple of them started first. But what we can do with this is I can use the drill to do it under power. So let me get all of them started a little bit. And there's one more thing on the drill that you can use. So if your drill has it and you turn it to the screw icon, and you may not have the screw icon, you may just have this dial in front. This dial in front is a clutch. And so if it's all the way down, if you try to drill, it's moving, but if I put any force on it, it stops moving and it makes that clicking sound. And that is the clutch tripping out. So I can actually set this somewhere, and I don't know what the right number is going to be for this build, to where it'll tighten in, but it won't over-tighten it. So let's try 11 for starters. So you can see that is tripping, and I'm not quite flat yet. So let's turn it up to 12 and see where that gets us. So I'm still going to do kind of that star pattern, get all of them started. That one went all the way down and flat before it started clicking. So that is about the perfect setting for me. So this one's in. I'll go back to this one. That one's not quite going. We'll get that one in, come across to this one. Now, if you don't have the clutch set, right, and you're on kind of the drill setting to where it will not, it's locked and it will keep spinning, it's fine. You can do it that way, but you've got to kind of slow down when you get to the end. You've got to kind of slow down and not overdo it. So you can see when I have the clutch set at, let me turn that back, the clutch set at 12, I can just go full speed and it stops for me. And that saves a little bit of time, makes it a little bit less likely that I'm going to do any damage. But again, you can do it the other way. And one of the things I like to do sometimes too is any of the ones that are just a little bit loose, you can just go back to the socket and do it by hand just so you can really feel, right? Like I can feel this one, that is tight all the way. This one's tight all the way, right? And I can just kind of give it that last check by hand just to make sure nothing's wrong. One of the reasons why you want to make sure you get these wheels right the first time is once they're in the robot, they're kind of hard to get to, especially these screws to work on them. So make sure they're all the way in the first time and you won't have problems later. All right, that's 2 done. I'm going to get the last 2 done with the power drill here, and then we'll be ready for our next step. Okay, now we have all of our outside wheels with their pulleys attached. All 4 of those are done. Our next step is to add bearings into these wheels. So let's find the bag of bearings that came in the kit and dump that out. Now we're going to need 8 bearings for this, and there are 10 bearings in the bag. So we have to find the right 8. There's actually 2 different kinds here. So one of them is labeled 1614ZZ, and there is another set that's labeled FR8Z. And they look kind of the same from one direction, but this one is flat around the outside. The FR8Zs have what we call a flange. So you can see there's this little edge on the bottom that's sticking out that we can kind of use if you were pressing it into a hole that would stop it from going too far in the hole. But in this case, the 2 with the flange, the FR8Zs, those ones, go ahead and put them back in the bag. We will use those in a little bit. For right now, we need just the 1614ZZs. All right, and for these, we need to put them one on the wheel side and one into the pulley. And these can be a little tight. So what I like to do is if you get it started on, let's do the pulley side first. You can kind of try to line it up and push it in. And it will try to kind of bend on you as you're pushing it in. So right now, this side is higher, so I want to push on that side. And then kind of keep pushing all the way around until you'll feel it kind of hit a point where it doesn't go anymore. If you look really from the side, it's going to be very close to flat, even with the top of the pulley there. Right? And that is in all the way. And on the other side, we're going to take another bearing and try to get this one started. Now, this side is much, much harder to get going. So if you kind of get it started, if you can even get it a little bit started, what you might be able to do is turn it upside down and try to push down on the table to get it to push all the way in. So you can see mine went in, and that is all the way. So you can see this side, it's going to stick out a little bit past the wheel, and that is all the way in. If you can't get it to go by pushing down on the table, you can use, if you use a soft mallet, you can kind of tap on it. One of the things when you're hitting bearings, though, is this middle part that spins. That's the inner race of the bearing. You do not want to hit that part if you can help it. So if I were tapping this in, I would sort of go gently around the outside to get it to seat. But the table trick should work if you're pushing down, especially if it's a nice wood table. It's a little bit soft, so you won't damage the bearings that way. All right, this is one wheel done. We've got 3 more to do. Looks good. That is good. All right, 4 outside wheels done. Let's do our 2 inside wheels. Now, the inside wheels are going to be different because they are going to have a pulley on both sides, and we need this hub, this metal insert, and this is what's actually going to attach to our transmission, to our motors that are going to drive the wheels. So the main wheel is going to get driven, then the pulleys are going to be connected with belts to the outside wheels on one side and the other outside wheel on the other side. So luckily for us, one side of this wheel is exactly the same as what we did before. Once again, we'll line up the 2 bumps, and we can just screw that in the same as the outside wheels. I'll go straight to the power tool here. All right, those look good. And then on this side, we are going to have another pulley that goes on there. But the trick with this one is this metal hub needs to slide inside of that pulley. And we're going to take a few extra steps to make sure this works out right. So there are the holes on the pulley here, and there are the holes on this hub, and we have to make sure when we press this in that those holes line up. So it's pretty easy for me to, if I push it in a little bit off, what happens is here, it hits. I'm not down in the grooves, right? This should sit flat, and we should be in the grooves, and you can see those holes are not lined up, so I could not put the screws in to hold it all together. If you try to put it together and that happens, you can try to push it out from the other side. If you can't push it out, that is another point where you can use the hammer to kind of tap on it to get it removed. Also, sometimes if it's getting close, you can push down on the table. And the last thing you can do is when it's all the way kind of flat as far as you can get pushing it, we can use something on the inside to pry it up. So that would be a good job for a wrench. We can get underneath the lip here and just sort of start prying up the edges. And you can see this is kind of annoying, so it's good if we can get it right the first time. But just kind of keep prying. You'll eventually get it popped out, and then we can try again. So a good way to try to make sure that this is going to line up is if we take two of our screws and drop them into those holes. We can then line those screws up with holes on our hub underneath. And that is maybe not perfectly aligned, but it's going to help keep it pretty close. So once that's in, then I'm going to start pressing on this to get it to slide in. And you can see just like when I was doing the bearing, I'm sort of pressing on whatever side looks like it's higher up in the air. So it's wobbling its way in, and it's like we are just about there. Give it a heavy, hard press, and that's it. So now this is in. I can take the screws out. Right? And that is in and flat. If it's not all the way in, you can do the flip over and push it on the table. But also when we tighten the screws, it's going to pull it all together as well. So if it's not perfectly flat, that's okay. The key is those holes are all perfectly aligned. We can see through all of the holes, and we can drop a bolt through all of the holes. That's what we need right now. All right? And if it's a little snug, that's okay. Because again, we can use the screwing part of the screw to kind of get through if it's a little tiny bit off. So now that we have this metal piece aligned, we can take our second hub, and this is also a little bit tricky because it's going to be tight when we put it on. So we need, again, to make the raised bumps go into our holes here. So I'm going to line it up as much as I can. And when we start squeezing this on, it's going to be hard to rotate that as well. So you can, again, drop a couple of screws in as you're doing this to try to keep it lined up. And if those screws are in, hopefully you can just sort of wiggle it until it sits flat. And this one especially, right, we want to make sure it's all the way closed. Right now I still have a little bit of a gap going on. And I think maybe I didn't squeeze it quite tight enough. So I'll keep squeezing around. Another thing you can do too here is you can tap on this, but you have to be careful if you're tapping on this. I would tap on the metal in the middle. You don't want to tap on the outside part of the plastic because you can break that off. If it does break off, it's kind of not the end of the world, but we want to avoid that if we can. All right, I think mine is close enough to where when we start tightening the screws, it's going to flatten the rest of the way. So we have our wheel with a pulley on one side. We're going to flip it over. This attaches on the other side. It attaches in exactly the same way. We're going to have 6 screws going around the outside. And we tighten them with that same star pattern. So let me get them all started. And once again, you can do this with the socket if you need to, or with the drill if you have one. Got to jump to the other side. All right, and then I'm going to go and switch back to my socket here really quickly just to make sure they all went nice and tight. This one did not quite go in all the way. Looks good. Yep, and this time I think because that metal is in there, it's a little bit harder to tighten these bolts all the way down. So Make sure you do check these by hand with the socket to make sure they are all the way tight before moving on to your next wheel. All right, those are in. Oh, there we go. There we go, nice and tight. Maybe not this one. Let's get this one. Oh, yeah, that was tight. All right, so we're good. This is one of our inner wheels. And now, of course, we've got to do one more. So I'm going to repeat that whole process one more time. And then I think we're ready to start working on the motors. Nope. All right, that one didn't quite line up, so I'll pop it out and try again. There it is, much better. All right, so we've got our 2 center wheels done now with the pulleys on both sides, and our 4 outside wheels done. So now let's get started on our motors and transmission. Okay, so to assemble our motors and transmissions, guess what? We actually need our motors and our transmission bags. So find the 4 sim motors that we had earlier. We're going to need all 4 of those for this step, and then there are these bags that came with the transmission pieces inside of them. They've got this kind of fancy plastic nylon piece that you can find. That's how you know you have the right bag. What we need from it right now is there's a little hardware bag with screws, bolts, and nuts and stuff. We need that out of here. And we also need, if you find the bag with the gears, we're going to need that bag with the gears. And in that bag, actually, let's go ahead and just get the gears we need for this step. So if I'll dump this whole bag out. And we've got 2 big gears. We don't need those yet. There are 3 smaller gears, but 2 of them are the smallest. So this one's a little bit bigger. It's also got this raised boss edge here. That one we don't need yet. We just need the 2 tiniest gears. So I'm going to put everything back in the bag so I don't lose it. And I'll actually keep all of this together as well. I don't want to mix up my transmission parts. So I'll close that bag back up. And then we need these same 2 things from our other transmission bag. And we're, of course, doing 2 transmissions because we're going to have a transmission with motors that drive the right side of the robot and another one with motors that drive the left side of the robot. So we're going to do everything here twice. Let's get the 2 smallest gears out of there. Put everything back in. And we are ready to start assembling these motors. All right, so on the motor, what we're looking for is from the hardware bag. I guess on the motor first, you can see there's this slot right here in the front. And that's called a keyway. And the idea is if I just took this gear, or this pinion gear, and put it on here, I can spin the gear on the motor shaft. But what we need to have happen is when the motor spins, it makes this gear spin, which can then make all of the rest of the gears in our transmission spin, which will eventually make our wheels spin. So we need something to lock this gear onto this output shaft of our motor. And that is what we use this keyway for. And inside of the keyway, let's go ahead and carefully pour this bag out. Don't lose any of the parts, except the piece of paper. I don't need that. There are 2 very tiny, there they are. These are called machine keys. And this machine key will fit right into that keyway. Okay, but before we put that in, we actually have to put another piece on first. But that's the idea. If that key is in there, then inside of this gear, you can see there's actually a little cutout, a little square cutout that's also going to fit that key. And that's how we're going to lock everything together. But first, there are 2 of these washers. Well, actually, there's 4 washers in the bag. But we're going to take 2 washers, slide them onto the output of the motor shaft here. 1, 2. All right, and now we're going to take that key. And you just got to get that key into the keyway. And I like to just kind of bring down the outside corner first. And if you get that outside corner kind of stuck in there, then you can sort of squeeze the rest in. Now, this is a step where if your key is not going in all the way, if it's not going in and sitting flat, you want to grab a pair of pliers and squeeze it in the rest of the way. You'll know if it's good or not because if I take that pinion gear and I try to slide it on, you see I'm going to line up the key with the keyway, and mine does not go on. So I think I have to try to squeeze this down a little bit more. So let me grab a pair of pliers. And I'm just going to try to squeeze it into that output shaft, into that keyway more. And I can see that dropped in way farther. And now I think when I try to slide this on, there it goes, no problem, right onto that key. And you can also see if you try it now, if you try to turn the gear now, instead of just spinning on the output shaft, it's actually spinning the output shaft and the motor with it. So they are locked together. But we have to stop this whole thing from falling apart, right? We got to keep that trapped on there so it doesn't move. And to do that, we are going to use our retaining clip. So it looks like this. It's kind of like a star pattern in the middle maybe. It's got a bunch of these teeth inside there. And if we push this on here and force it on, what this does is it'll slide on one way and then it kind of locks in place and doesn't want to come off. So if you take a look at this very carefully, you can see that those teeth in the center, or those prongs in the center, they're kind of sloped in one direction. So right now they're sloped down towards the table. If I flip it over now, they're kind of pointing up in the air. What we want to do is the side that they're pointing away from, so in this case, the side that's towards the table is the side that's going to go in first. You can also kind of tell that that's the right direction because on one side, let me flip a second one up here, you can kind of see there's this outside groove. and on this side it's sort of rounded over. So we want the rounded over side to be facing in towards the motor. And if you can get it to start pushing on at all with your fingers, that's usually the easiest way to get it started. But if you can't get it started at all, then we'll go straight to step number 2. And this one's pretty tight. I'm having a hard time here. So step number 2 is that socket that we got before. That socket, make sure the piece will sit on that socket. And what that's going to do is that's going to give us a lot more leverage to push on to make this clip go on. So what I can do is now I can use that socket and really kind of, I'm also still rotating around a little bit to try to get it to go. And if you sort of wobble it around like that, you can see now I'm on the shaft. This is probably the hardest step of this whole transmission thing. But just keep wobbling it down until you're all the way touching the motor. If you get it started and the wobbling isn't working, then go ahead and grab your mallet and you can kind of tap it down the rest of the way. All right, and once that gear is trapped in place and can't fall off, we are ready to do 3 more motors, the exact same thing. So one's done. Let's get started on our second motor. 2 washers, machine key, squeeze that in, slide the gear on. One of the things you want to look for when you're doing this is if you slide the gear on and you see a lot of that machine key sticking out, then you need to take it out and slide it in farther so it's close to the washers. Get as close to the washers as you can with that machine key, because when we put this on, where is the keyway? There it is. When we put this on and slide this in, if it's only resting on the machine key, then our gear can still kind of move back and forth a little bit. If you see just a teeny tiny bit sticking out, that's probably okay. You can probably just go with that. But if a lot's sticking out, you should try to move it back in closer. All right, and once again, take that clip and push it on. All right, I am going to put the rest of the hardware back into my bag here so I don't lose it. And do the last 2 motors. We are ready now to attach these motors to our transmission housing. So back to this bag, we need the plastic outer housing of the transmission. I'm going to grab both of them right off the bat. We don't need the rest of the parts yet. Now, if we look at this housing from this side, what we can see is there are 2 holes that are kind of in the middle, aligned with this little bump on the top here. And those holes are going to be for gears and our internal bearings. These 2 holes that are on the edges right next to this sort of like, I don't know, heat sink shaped piece, these fins out here, these holes are where we're going to bring our motors in. And we need to make sure we attach our motors with the right screws. So once again, we'll dump out this bag. We need to find, there should be 4 screws in there that are shorter and 4 screws that are longer. And so we can see the difference here. This one is a little bit longer. This one is a little bit shorter, and all of the shorter ones have a little bit of a patch of, it's like yellow or tan on it. And that's actually to help this screw stick. So when it screws in, that'll help it from unscrewing. And so those are the ones we need right now, the shorter ones with that little tan or yellow patch on them. And the rest of the pieces, I'll slide carefully off to the side. All right, and what we're going to do then is in this housing, remember, next to the fins, we're going to take this from the side where the label is. So we're going to find that label. This motor is going to drop right through that hole next to the fins, next to the label. That's where the motor goes. You can actually see there's a nice round cutout for it, so it fits in there perfectly. All right. On the motor, before we put it in, though, too, you can look and see there are 4 holes here, But 2 of them are already full. There's already stuff inside those 2 holes, so we cannot screw into those 2 holes. We have to screw into the empty ones. So I'm going to line those 2 empty screw holes up with these little 2 holes when I put it in. All right, like so. And now from the top, if I look down from the top, I can kind of rotate this around until I can see into those clear holes, or clearly into those 2 holes that are empty. And once we've done that, then we're going to take these screws that we just picked out, and they're going to drop right into those holes. And what we want to use for this step is that Allen wrench that we talked about earlier, this 5/32. And you should be able to just screw it straight in. And we just want to take both sides until they're nice and tight. And I am going to tighten, I'm going to get both of them started before I tighten one all the way. All right, and then I'll go ahead and take this one all the way tight. Perfect. Take this one all the way tight. And you want to make sure these are tight. You don't have to like crush the box, crush that transmission housing, but it is very, very annoying to have to open the entire transmission back up to get back to these bolts and tighten them later. So make sure they are in and tight all the way. The other thing I want you to try right now is just with your thumb or with your finger, try to spin that gear and make sure it spins freely. All right, if it doesn't spin freely, then your motor is maybe slightly misaligned or not tightened up all the way, but that should be nice and easy to spin. All right, one motor down. Let's do the other motor for this transmission and then get started on the other one. All right, motors are attached to our transmissions. Next step, we're going to build out the gearing inside. So back to our bags of parts. And now we pretty much need everything. So I'm going to empty this one out. And from this bag, we need the gears to kind of come out, or the bearings to come out. We don't need the grease quite yet. And then from our gear bag, we need all of the gears. All right. Now, before we get started, there are these pins that exist in here. And if you are going to use the encoders, the E4T encoders with this transmission, what you need to do is glue, super glue these pins into the shafts. And they go on the side with the extra step. So a couple of drops of super glue, push that in, and you should be good to go. We're going to assemble ours without these for today. and we'll see if we have time at the end of all of these videos to come back and add the encoders. So I'll leave those in the bag so I don't lose them, but we need all of the rest of the parts. All right, so this is our main output shaft. This is going to be our intermediate shaft, our middle shaft, idler shaft. And then we've got our bearings here. Again, 2 bearings have no flange, and 2 bearings have that flange. And one is bigger with a hex-shaped hole in the middle, so we'll keep those straight when we're looking for those. And then for gears, we have our 50-tooth gear. That's the biggest one. Then we have a 45-tooth gear, and then finally a 19-tooth gear, and then one little plastic spacer. All right, so the first step is we have these other 2 holes in here where we kind of didn't add anything. We added our motors to the sides, but the top and bottom holes are empty. So in those 2 top and bottom holes, we are going to take our flangeless bearings, so the ones that are flat. I think these are going to be R6Zs, and they should just drop perfectly into those 2 holes. No problem. Okay, then what we're looking for is, you see how one side of the transmission is flat and one side has this sort of bump on it, this sloped domed roof. Okay, so on the flat side is where we're going to be working. We're going to take this little shaft, and the round part of it should fit right into that bearing. Perfect. Okay, then onto that shaft, the next step is the big 50-tooth gear. Now on this 50-tooth gear, there's a couple things to look at. On one side, it has a little bit of a raised center. We call that a boss on the center, this raised boss here. On the other side, it's perfectly flat. We need to make sure that that boss is facing towards the bearing we put in. Okay, so we're going to take this, and this has a hex-shaped hole in the middle, as does our shaft is hex-shaped. So if you try to put this on and it doesn't go down, you have to kind of rotate them with each other. And if you're really having a lot of trouble doing that, you can take this shaft out and get it started on the gear first, and then slide the whole thing back in. And once it's in, we need to make sure this gear pushes all the way down. And you can see mine, when I was pushing it down, it sort of hit for a second first, because the gear teeth were hitting on the gears we put on our motors earlier. So if that happens to you, all you've got to do is turn it a little bit until the gear teeth line up, and then it should drop all the way down nice and flat. And so what you can see happening here is our motors are now driving these little pinion gears. They're going to drive this big gear, this big 50-tooth gear in the middle, which then is going to be able to connect to another gear that we're going to attach in a second. So next up on here, on top of our 50-tooth gear, we need to put that little plastic spacer in. So it's got a hex-shaped hole in the middle. It is black nylon, I think. It's plastic either way. Slide that down so that's right on top of the 50-tooth gear. And then on top of that is going to be our 19-tooth gear. So the little one's going to go next. Just drop that right on top. Again, you have to rotate it until the hexes line up. And then mine's a little tight, but should go. That is very tight. All right, that is not going all the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap on that with a hammer. Let me see if I get the right socket size here. Just use this one. This is my 7/16 one again. It's bigger than the hole in the middle there. And I'll just give it a couple taps. And I don't have to hit it very hard, but that is now in all the way. And so you can see when I spin this, right, all of the gears now move together. All right, now we have to start working on the output shaft side of things. So we are going to take the output shaft. And if you look closely, there is a little groove here. So we have the end that's turned down. This is going to fit into our bearing. And then we have a little groove next to it. And that groove is designed for this E-clip. So we're going to put this E-clip into that groove, and that's going to help keep everything aligned on this shaft with the other gears. So there's a few different ways you can do this. If you're really got tough fingers, you can sometimes just push on it with your fingers and get it to snap into place. A lot of times it works good if you can get it lined up on the table to just push it down into the table again. There we go, that's snapped in. What you want to do is make sure that it is snapped in all the way around. Sometimes this top one will catch on the side, like it'll twist a little bit when it goes in. So if that's not in, just bend it a little bit and then push again until that is all the way in. So there are those three like teeth of the E-clip, and they should be fully in the groove. All three of them should be fully in the groove. All right, then this is ready to go into the rest of our transmission here. We're going to drop that down into our other bearing. So this is the top bearing that's on the domed side of our transmission. And that little tiny bit should fit right into the bearing. And then we need to drop another gear on to mate with this 19-tooth gear. And that is our 45-tooth gear. So we'll drop that on. Again, you got to line the hexes up. It should slide all the way down. And now that gear meshes together. So now when the motors spin, and this is going to be really hard to turn backwards because it's a pretty big gear ratio here. And so that's the idea, is if we take these motors, these sim motors spin at something like 5,000 RPM. And if we tried to make the wheels on our robot spin at 5,000 RPM, our robot would try to go so fast that it would be completely uncontrollable. But worse than that, it wouldn't actually have enough torque or strength to be able to move the wheels at all. So we have to slow these motors down in order to get a more reasonable speed. And so we're going from these pinions here to a bigger gear. And anytime you go from a small gear to a bigger gear, if you think about it, every time it turns a little bit, right, one tooth on the small gear is pushing one tooth on the big gear. So if we spin this little one all the way around, the big gear is not going to go all the way around. So we're going to have to spin it around again. So in this case, we have a 19-tooth gear to a 45-tooth gear. So the first time that the 19-tooth gear goes all the way around, that's 19 teeth on the 45-tooth gear. We spin it around again, that's 19 more teeth. So that takes us to 38 teeth of the 45. And then we have to spin it around another part of a time, 7 more teeth, right? So we have to spin it around 7/19ths of a time, and that will make the output shaft spin once. So the output shaft is going to be spinning 2-point-something times slower than this gear, and we have the same adjustment here. And I think all in this gearbox does something like an 8.4 to 1 reduction. So we're slowing our motors down 8 times, which is going to get us much closer to a reasonable driving speed. Okay, this transmission is almost done. We're going to take our last 2 bearings here. And the littler bearing with the round hole is going to sit on top of this little shaft that we had in here. And remember, these have that flanged raised edge. So the flange side should be facing down towards the gears. So when I put this on, the flange is on the bottom, and then the nice smooth part is on the top. And we're going to do the same thing with our other gear, our other bearing that we have in here. This one has a hex-shaped hole, so again, you might have to get it to rotate to line up. And sometimes it helps if you hold that if you put your finger in the middle on that inner race so it doesn't also rotate with the shaft. Once that's lined up, we're going to drop it down. And once again, the flange is on the bottom because we're going to take another piece and slide it on here. And so if the flanges were there, it would not fit. All right, this transmission is done. Let's get this one up to the same place, and then we'll grease them up. Okay, so officially, if you have a way to power your motors, we could assemble this, which is the step we're going to show you in a minute. You could assemble this to the frame and power the motors. The idea is that when these gears come off of the factory, they have some still rough edges on them. And if you run the gearbox ungreased, it'll sort of wear itself in and get your gearbox running a little bit better. So if you do have a way to power the motors safely, you can go ahead and skip to the next step, assemble it, power the motors up, but then you got to disassemble it and come back and do the grease. You cannot run for the entire season without grease in your gearboxes. They will shred themselves. The teeth will break off. They'll shear off. So we're going to just go ahead and grease ours right off the bat because we do not have a good way to power our motors. And I think probably a lot of the rookie teams that might be following along also will not have that. So let's go into, actually before I get the grease out, I'm going to take some of these shop rags here and I'm going to put a few down on the table so that hopefully I can keep the mess a little bit contained. I'll do this one first. All right, and then do not open both of these. One is going to be more than enough grease for what we're doing. So there's a little tear spot on the top here. We can tear it open. It will leave a little spot for the grease. If you are really a clean freak, now's a good time to get gloves because this is going to get all over the place. And our goal is to cover, basically we want to get it on the gear teeth, on as much of the gear teeth as we can. Just kind of squeeze some of that out, and I'll just get it around wherever we can get it around. And one of the cool things is once it gets started, I'll kind of wipe it on with my finger. Quick safety note here though is if you're turning this, if you're turning these gears and your finger is in between them, you can pinch your fingers, so watch out for that. But what's going to end up happening is when these gears spin, it's going to do a good job of spreading that grease out. You can see as that passed through there, it's doing a good job of spreading that grease out and getting it on other areas. But I'm going to try to wipe it around as much as I can on the different teeth here. Get some down on the bottom. And if you have to, you could take this axle out. That will actually all stay together. And that makes it a little bit easier to get to the bottom one to grease it up. Oh, yeah. And we just need a layer there. It doesn't have to look super red or anything like that. Spin that one around a little bit. Put some more on this side. And if you do end up squirting out too much, then go ahead and open the second. You can go ahead and open the second container of grease here. But I think I'm going to have enough to be just fine. And I like to turn it, just get it really everywhere. And that's looking good to me for this bottom section. If anything, maybe a little bit too much. And then it's really easy with this gear out to just kind of get all the way around the outside of it. All right, and then we'll drop this. I'm going to wipe my hand off so I don't get too much of it on the rest of this. Drop this back in. All right, and this one is now greased and ready to go. Let's do the other one. Right, that's looking good in there. And that's plenty of goo for that one. All right. All right, remember if you skipped ahead and you were powering your motors just to wear in your gearbox, go back to the previous step, add the grease before you put the final plate on for good for your final assembly. All right, what we need to do is we need to orient this correctly. So find the domed section. Remember we had the flat side and the dome side. Turn it so the dome side is facing down towards the table. And then we're going to get our plate. These were the inner rails. Remember they're kind of like that Z shape or that weird, we got the two bends but going in opposite directions. This is going to attach on here. And what we know is the big hole here is going to be for the big bearing down there. The small hole is for the small bearing. But what's important is that we get this flange pointing in the right direction, right? Because I could attach it this way, where the flange is pointing in towards the motors, or I could spin it around and attach it this way, where this top flange is pointing away. And that's what we need. We actually need that top flange to be pointing away from the motors. Then when we go ahead and line this up, that output shaft is going to go through that big hole on the bottom. They're going to line up on the bearings. And there are some actually little pins on the transmission that are going to line up with some little holes, and everything is going to kind of snap into place. All right, so once again, double check and make sure that your flat section has the flanges pointing away. Your domed section has the flanges pointing in towards the motors, and that is our bottom, I believe. Okay, then we have to actually bolt this all together. So that is the rest of the hardware that we had from our previous step. We should have 4 of these bolts and 4 nuts, and those are going to go through. If we go to the very top corner, that's one hole where it's going to go through. So let's go ahead and put those in first. Now, what's interesting is on the back of this transmission, there is actually a hex-shaped hole here. So we'll be able to put the nut right into that hole, and we don't need a wrench or anything to hold onto the nut to make it go together. But really quickly before we get started, this is a 1032 bolt socket head cap screw. And it's going to screw into this nut, but it's very important that we look at the nut closely. So if you look at the nut, one side looks mostly just metal, and we see the threads showing up. The other side, you can see this white plastic on the inside. That's actually nylon. This is called a nylock nut. And the idea is when we tighten this bolt in, it's going to actually cut into that nylon, and that nylon is going to help hold on to it and stop it from loosening up. And on the robot, it's very important that anywhere possible, you use these nylock nuts, because these robots, they're moving, they're vibrating, they're crashing into stuff. Bolts are going to loosen up if you don't have something like that to stop it. So when we tighten these together, the bolt should go into the side that does not have the nylon first, so it can get screwing or get started screwing, and then it's going to go through the nylon second. So on my transmission over here, I'm going to take this nut, I'm going to take the flat metal side and slide it in, so I'll still be able to see the nylon side kind of poking out the back. And then we can run our bolt in from the other side. And once again, it's the same 5/32 Allen wrench. And we can just screw that in. And in this case, we still might want to start them all, but I'm just going to take this one tight because those pins that went in, those little plastic alignment pins, are going to make sure that everything stays lined up. All right, and then we'll get that one in a second. I'll put another one in here, and we'll screw this one in. Right, and that is the top done. Now we got to put 2 more bolts on the bottom. So for the bottom, what we're looking at is, you can kind of see if you look closely, right? There are these 2 holes that you can see through. And they are also the right size, and they'll be a little bit out from the ones we put in before. But if you try the hole next to it, it doesn't fit. In this hole, it's way too big, way too big, way too big. So this is the right hole right here. So if you kind of go in from the corner, you see the 2 holes next to each other. We're going through the bigger of those 2 holes. And once again, on the back of this, let me flip it over so we can see again. We've got another spot where we're going to slide one of our nylock nuts into. And you got to hold it in that spot just so that the hex shape hole will grab onto the nut. And we'll screw that one in. And one more, this is going to be the same hole on the other side where we're dropping this through. And then one more nylock nut from the back side. And let's screw this one in. All right, our first side is done. Of course, we have to repeat this on the second side. And at some point, I'm going to have to go and find that bolt I dropped. Okay, flat side pointing away. Wait. With the point down. Flat side pointing away. We did it. We got there. Anybody see where they went? Oh, good. All right, we've got our finished side plates, inner side plates, with our motors and transmissions attached. Now we're going to kind of turn this into the frame of the robot. So we're going to take the front and back pieces. Remember, that's the channel where one side is tall and one side is short. And we are going to connect these together. So let's get everything aligned correctly, though, before we get started. Also, before we get started, make sure you find this bag of bolts and nuts. These are the same bolts and nuts that we used in the last step, except they're a little bit shorter. We're going to need a bunch of those. You're going to need your 5/32 Allen wrench, whichever one you want to use. And you're going to need a 3/8 wrench or socket to be able to hold the other side, because we don't have that little cutout in the transmission for us. All right, but let's get this aligned. The transmission shaft, this long output shaft, should be on the bottom towards the table. So we want to flip them so they are looking like that. And the motors should be pointing towards each other. So really, it's going to look something like that. And they are going to be very close. So these wires might get in the way. We'll kind of make sure they're bent out a little bit. But this is going to go very close together. And this frame is going to slide on one on the front and one on the back. Now, when this goes on, we have the smaller edge is going to be on top. The longer edge is going to be on the bottom. And I'm just going to move one of these out of the way, and we'll get the first one attached here. Let me go ahead and open this up and get a few of these out. All right, what we're looking to do here is we're looking for this hole, this very end hole on this piece here, to line up with the 8th hole in from the side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the hole I want to line up to. So slide this over, try to push it in. And let me count again just to make sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep. I'm going to drop a bolt in. Now this bolt, theoretically, you could make it go up from the bottom or down from the top. It kind of, anytime we put a bolt in, it's really what is the easiest for you to do. How can you get to the bolt to tighten it? Generally speaking, having the head on top where you have lots of space is good because you can get your Allen wrench or your hex key on it. And then on the other side, like a wrench can fit pretty nicely in the little bit of space that's left. But what I like to do is we have to get this started first before we worry about the tools. And you can try to bring this up and screw it in by hand. That's one way to do it. I like to kind of bring this bolt up, and if you push up against the nut up and push up against the bolt, and I'm just kind of holding it there, pressed against the metal, I can kind of wiggle it around until it's lined up, and while screwing in this bolt, I can feel now it's catching on the nylon. So that bolt is in place. Then I'll take my wrench and attach that on the nut on the bottom. See if maybe that's a better angle. All right, and then I will just tighten down with this one on the top. Now for this one, don't tighten it all the way. If you tighten it all the way, back it off a little bit. I want to still be able to bend this a little bit because we're going to make sure that our frame is square, and we also have to make sure that all of the bolts fit. We got the bottom bolts to line up. We got the other side bolts to line up. So we want everything to line up before we tighten everything down. So we're going to go around and loosely attach all the bolts, then we'll go back around and tighten them down all the way. All right, so with this piece that we've got now attached, I'm going to flip it over. And on this side, we want to do 2 bolts into here to attach it, but we are looking for the 10th hole in. So it should automatically line up there, but I'm still going to count just to make sure nothing is bent or it's not twisted out of the way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Perfect. So we can drop our 2 bolts in here. And they'll kind of help hold it lined up. Grab some of these nuts, and it's the same process. I'm just going to reach up from the bottom and get them started. And then I'll switch to the tool. And if you do have a wrench that ratchets, you can use that instead. I actually find I don't mind turning the Allen wrench too much, so I'm just going to do it that way for now. This is another step too, where if you have 2 people working on it, you could have somebody holding the wrench in from one side and another person tightening it on the top. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to see what's going on, right? But I'm not going to tighten it quite all the way. Leave it a little bit loose. All right. So I can still shift this around if I need to make sure everything else lines up. All right. Next up, let's go ahead and grab the other. Let me flip this back around so it's sort of like, this is our base orientation, all right? Output shaft is down. And right now, we don't really have a front or back to our robot, so we're going to bring this one in now. But remember, I have to find 8 holes in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the one. You might see a little faded out circle on hole number 9. I definitely did not miscount that in the previous take. All right, let's line this up and get it bolted in. And one more time. Okay, looks good. We're going to flip the whole thing over. Again, flipping it over, we've got these big, heavy motors, and things can kind of still flex and bend, so try to support the motors as much as possible. And now we're looking at the 10th holes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've already circled those. So let's go ahead and drop our bolts in here. And this one, I actually have to push on this a little bit to get it to line up. You can see the motors are sort of dragging it down. So I got to push it over a little bit. That's okay. Get those bolts dropped in. All right, this side is good. We're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. So we'll flip it all over. And again, we have to make sure that this matches. So I've got the short side on top, flat side on top with the labels, and then the round sides on the bottom and the long sides are on the bottom. So before I even put this one in, let's just count and circle the holes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And now I should do both of the top bolts first, and then I'll flip it over and get the bottom ones. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, all of our bolts are set. They're still loose. I can still shift this whole thing around. The last thing we're going to do before we tighten them up is I'm going to try to put a square along the edge here and kind of move it until It sits nice and flat on both sides. You can check another spot here. Looks like that one's, there we go. How's it looking over here? That looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. Looks like we're going to be a little bit in between. So we'll have both sides a little bit off. Now it can actually be super crooked in this step and it'll still work. So just try to make it, kind of balance it, make them all as square as you can make them. And now I'm just going to go through and I'm going to crank down and fully tighten all of the bolts that we put in the last step. All right, we've gone through, tightened up all of the bolts so our frame is nice and sturdy. Eventually, we're going to bring those other side plates in to hold all of our wheels and stuff together. But before we do that, we're going to have more support between the inside plate and the outside plate. And that is, you should have a bag of tiny churros that are already pre-cut to the right length. So there should be 8 of these. And we're going to end up attaching these on the side here. And when we bring the other plate in, we'll be able to screw to that on the other side to keep everything nice and supported. So find your 8 churros, and the bolts we need for those are these hex head ones. So we're looking for, I think these are technically self-tapping, I think they're tri-lobe hex head bolts. So we're going to need those. We're going to need 8 of them, but we've got some extra ones here. And for this step, you can use a 3/8 socket to try to tighten those in. And we need a 1/2-inch wrench, which will fit onto the churro piece to hold it in place while we screw this in. And screwing this in is going to be pretty difficult because there are no threads yet in our churro piece, so we're going to have to cut the threads as we go. If you have access to a driver or a drill, if you can get a 3/8-inch bit or a 3/8-inch socket attached to that, that's going to make your life a lot easier. But we'll do a couple the hard way and then probably switch over and finish it up the easy way. Now, the trick is we have to make sure that we find the right holes on the outside of our frame to attach these churro pieces to. So let's turn this one around so we can all see it. And on the outside here, if you go from the output shaft and come out to the side, you see where the corner is here, where the plate attaches, where the plate kind of comes up and bends in that corner? What we want to do is we want to go up that corner to the first round hole that's right here. That's where we're going to attach one of them. And then from that one, if we go straight up, it's going to be kind of straight up and then a little bit farther out away from the motors. That's the second place we're going to attach. And we're doing the same thing on the other side, up from where the bend is in the plate, that first hole, and then diagonally up and out, that's the second hole. So those are the 4 we're going to put on this side. Let me go ahead and mark the other side now while I remember which holes it is, and then we'll start attaching. All right, so from the corner, and up, from the corner, and up. All right, so to attach these, we're going to take a bolt and we'll run it through. Let's do this hole. That seems like the easy one to reach for now. Oh, and the bolt should come from the inside of the frame, pointing out. And the churro is going to attach here on the outside. And you can see it gets really hard to screw this in. Like you can barely screw it in by hand at all. And that's because there are no threads yet. So we'll get the socket on the inside. You take your 1/2-inch wrench on the outside. You kind of need to get it a little bit started so you can hold on. Also, I'm going to put it into the box on my wrench. Is that the right way? This way. And that'll be a little bit easier to hold on to it. And we just have to kind of get that started. And getting it started is the hardest part. There we go. That is started now. And essentially what we have to do is just keep driving this until it goes nice and flat on the frame. There we go, nice and tight. Looks good. All right, so that's one churro in. You can do all of them that way if you have to. But I'm going to go ahead and do the bottom one. Make sure that's the right hole. I'll do the bottom one with my drill here, if I can get the drill to line up or to fit. Oh, I put the bolt in already. I don't need a second one. Seems good. Again, if you can get it started a little bit by hand, that helps a lot. And then we'll get this onto it. And whoop. There we go. Okay, nice and tight on that one. You can see it is definitely much faster with the power tools. So if you've got power tools, go ahead and use them. If not, you'll still get there. All right, let's do the other two on the back here. So I'm going to do the bottom one first. I think that one's a little harder to reach. And then that top hole. Yeah, sometimes you can get it to start, sometimes you can't. There we go. All right, so that's one side done. We're going to flip it around now, and we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Should we get the right hole? Okay. And our last one. All right, we've got those churro pieces attached. Next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to build out our wheel section, and then we will slide the outside frame rail in to hold everything together. So for this step, we need our outside frame rails. We need both of those. We need our timing belts. So again, I told you there's a bunch of timing belts in there. If you look at the timing belts, they have a number on them. So this one is a 6005M. That is not what we want. So the shortest ones are no good. The longest ones are no good. The ones we need 4 belts that are 655 5M. So find your 4 655 belts. Get rid of the other ones. And we're also going to need, in a little bit, we'll need those 2 bearings. that were left over from when we did our wheels earlier. We need this bag. It's got some big bolts and some big nuts in it. Those are going to actually be our wheel axles or wheel shafts. And then there is a bag of spacers that we're going to need. All right, and then we need all 6 of our wheels. Also for this step, we're going to be attaching the churros on the other side. So the wrenches that we used for that, or the driver, we're going to need again. In order to tighten up the main bolts, we're going to need the 9/16 socket and 9/16 wrench. We actually need 2 of those. So if you have 2 wrenches or 2 sockets, that's going to work. And we might need the hammer to bang some stuff into place. All right, let's get going. The first step is on the main output shaft here where it comes out of our transmission. We're going to take our middle wheel. Remember, the middle wheels have pulleys on both sides. And we're looking for the one with the metal insert. Take that metal insert, that metal hub, and that goes facing in towards the motors, and just slide that all the way on until it's touching. All right, next on this, we're going to take 2 of those timing belts, and we need to get one of them on that back pulley. So I'm going to kind of work my way around the wheel here, fish it around the wheel, and get it onto that back pulley. And it needs to go under this top churro. Okay, so when it's pulled tight, you can see it's going to not hit that churro. It's going to go right around them. Okay, so that one needs to be underneath it. And then we take another one for the other side, and this one we're just going to let hang out. It's eventually going to go in this path, but this one's easy to put on anytime. The back one, though, is hard to put on once we start getting our other pieces involved. All right, then when open this up, we're going to take 2 of these giant bolts out. And we have to find the right holes again. So once more, we're going to look at our frame here. And what you'll see is if you start from the edge and come in, there are these 2 big holes. There's lots of little holes, but there's just these 2 big ones that are over here. All right? And find the smaller of the 2 big holes and go down and away from the motors. And this is the hole where we are going to mount our wheel. And we can do the same thing on the other side. Find the smaller of the 2 big holes, go down and away from the motor, and this is the hole where we're going to mount our wheel on that side. So we're going to take one of those big bolts and slide it from the inside through that hole to the outside. And this belt is going to go right onto, we're going to have another wheel that's going to slide on here, and that belt's going to go right onto this wheel. But we need to have a little bit of space. If we just put this wheel on the way it is, it's going to actually go so far in that the belts are not going to line up. So we're going to have to get all of our spacing right, and that's what this bag of spacers is for. So again, open that up, and we have 3 different kinds of spacers here. So we've got this big hex spacer, which we're going to come back and put on the middle wheel in a second. And then we got 2 of those, 1 for each side. Then we've got these big, tall spacers, and then these tiny, short ones. All right? So the short one is going to go on the side where the pulley's going to be. So I'm going to slide one of those short ones on. Make sure you don't use your other center wheel. So this I'll set off to the side so I don't mix it up. But take another wheel, pulley facing in, and it kind of helps a little bit if you get it onto that belt first. And I'm going to bring that bolt, I'm actually going to slide that bolt out a little bit and get that pulled tight. Wait, I got to be underneath. Make sure your belt goes underneath that churro. And then that bolt should go right through the bearings in the middle of this wheel and slide that all the way through. All right, so now what you can see is when the middle wheel is powered, because it has that timing belt to the outside wheel, they are both going to spin together. So we're going to have 6-wheel drive on this robot. All 6 wheels will be powered, and that's really good. For example, when we're climbing up on the charge station, on that ramp at the end of the match, you want to have as much traction as you can get. Now, on the other side of this wheel, since we don't have a pulley, we have a lot more space before we get to our outside plate. So take one of the big spacers and slide that on. And since we're going to do a couple more steps before we get back to this wheel, I'm going to take one of the nuts from this bag. And all I'm going to do is just finger tighten that on. And now this pulley, this spacer can't fall off, the wheel can't fall off. Everything is going to stay together until we're ready to come back to it. All right, we got to do the same thing on the front, but with a small difference. On the front, we'll start with the bolt through the same hole, the hole that we circled here. But now we know this belt is going to be on the outside of our frame instead of the inside of the frame. So we can't put our wheel in with the pulley on the inside because it won't line up. So that means the inside is where we need the wider spacer. So get the big spacer and slide that on first. Then we're going to take the wheel with the pulley facing out, slide that on, and then we're going to need the tiny spacer. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and also put a nut on this one. Probably you could get away without doing this if we had done the other one first, the other spacer first. Also, this belt has to go on. So if you can get the belt on, usually it's loose enough that you can work this belt on after the fact. But if you can't get it to go on, then you have to slide the pulley out, slide the bolt out and line it up just like we did for the inside wheel. And they're loose right now because these bolts are not supported on the outside, right? They can still flex in and out. When we line up the outside plate and get all of those lined up, they're going to pull the belts nice and tight. All right, we do need one more spacer on this side of the middle shaft, and that is this big hex spacer. And all we got to do is line that hex up. And what you might find is as you try to push that on, it may be too tight to go into the pulley on the outside of the wheel like mine is. If that's the case, what you can do is grab a big socket. I think anything a half or bigger will work, but I'm going to use a 9/16. I'm going to line that up on the outside of the shaft here, and I'm just going to give it some taps. Okay, it's moving. And I think that is all the way in. I'll give it a couple more taps just to be sure. Yep, that did not move at all the second time I hit it there. So that's all the way in. Look for about that much of this sticking out, which should be the exact right amount for this bearing to go on it later. So that's what we're looking to put in there. All right, so now all of these are set up. We're going to slide this just a little bit over, so we've got just a little bit more space here. And this is kind of the tricky step. I don't want to lose my spacers, so let me move those over. And we do need that bearing now. It is time for that bearing, and it is time for the outside plate. Now this, or the outside frame rail. This outside, I guess it's C-channel, not plate, because it, yeah. So this is going to go on, and we're going to slide this on kind of like this. And you can see this giant hole on the bottom. That is where this bearing is going to go, and where we're going to pick up support of this shaft. Okay, because that fits perfectly on there. That's the first place we're looking. The second place we're looking is we have the same big and small hole. And so once again, and I can go ahead and circle that, this is the hole that our wheel bolt should come through. So find the big hole, the small hole, go slightly away from the center, below, and that's the one we're looking for. Also, in the middle, the bottom is where the big hole is. So this is down. And we've got the two slots above it. And then on this side, we've got the big hole, small hole go outside a little bit, and that is the hole that our other wheel is going to attach to. All right, so let's put the bearing in first. What we want to do is on the, not the inside part of this, flip it over so that we kind of see the outside of the C-channel. And this bearing needs to go into this hole. And try to push it in by hand first. And if you can get it to go, that's great. Mine went. If you can't get it to go, then you can go ahead and do the, tap it with the hammer trick that we did for the wheel bearings. Okay, now that bearing is going to be the first place that we line up, but we can't put this in until we take these nuts back off. So go ahead and remove these nuts now. And we need to be kind of careful not to lose the spacers as we do this. All right, so we're going to bring this up. I'm going to kind of line up that bolt to the hole. Looks good. And then this wheel bolt back here, I'm going to try to line up to this hole. All right. And then in the middle, I'm having a hard time getting that to line up. You can actually kind of see from the side, like that shaft is very low compared to where it needs to be. And the reason is right now, these motors, the weight of these motors is kind of twisting everything in a little bit. So I think to get that to line up, what I want to do is pick up on these motors, and there it goes. So I just lifted up on the motor and pushed in, and it popped right into place. I've got this wheel through. I'm going to go ahead and start a nut here so that doesn't fall out. On the other side, are we through? We're not quite through, so I'm going to just kind of wiggle the wheel. If you pull on the wheel itself, it's easier to move it, and there we go. Lined up and through. I'm going to start this nut on this side so it can't fall out. And now all we have to do to finish this is we have to tighten these bolts up, and then we have to add our churros and tighten those up. So let's do the wheel bolts first. I've got a 9/16 socket here and a 9/16 wrench. So I'll just kind of put the wrench on one side, socket on the other side, and we'll just tighten it down. Okay. And I think when I did that, my spacer maybe pushed in a little bit more here. The wheel also moved a little bit. We're looking good. All right, and you can make this pretty tight because this is sitting on a bearing, so it's still going to roll nice and freely. Now, you don't want to tighten this so much that we're crushing in on stuff. So again, when it kind of gets there, give it a little extra, and then that's good. All right, and now we do the same thing on the other side here. Okay, and that's tight. I'll give it just a little bit more, and we're good. And at this stage, you can roll the wheels, make sure they're still moving. Double check that your belts are correct, that your belts are both underneath these top churros. If they're running over the churro, those belt teeth are going to catch on the like sort of edges of the churro, and your drive will not work. So make sure they go below. And if it looks good like that, then we are ready to screw in the other sides of the churro to get that extra support that we talked about on this outside plate. So we'll grab those screws again. And you may or may not need to have the 1/2-inch wrench holding onto the churros here. Usually you don't, because the other side is already screwed in nice and tight, so it's not going to move. But we'll go ahead and do one with a socket. So yeah, we don't even need that. It's not. If it tries to spin, if the churro tries to spin in the middle on you, then go ahead and get the wrench out and hold it. But mine is tight enough on the inside bolt that it is not moving. So I'll be able to just go ahead and tighten this one down. Oh, we still got a ways to go. All right. Almost there. And that one's nice and tight. Once again, if the socket's all you've got, go ahead and finish up with the socket. If you do have a driver or a drill with an attachment, it's going to be much faster, so that's what I'm going to do for the other 4 churro pieces. So we got this one. Remember, it's diagonally down. You can see where it lines up, so we'll drive this one in. And on the other side, looks like we are right here. And then down here on the bottom. All right, this side of the drive is done. Now we're going to get started on the other side. There is one thing we have to watch for when we're doing the other side. Thus far, our robot had no front and had no back because it was perfectly symmetrical. Now it is no longer symmetrical. There is one difference, and that is we have an inside belt and an outside belt. Everything else is the same on the front and back of this robot, but the inside belt and the outside belt are differences that will matter for us later. So when we build this front of the robot, I believe the front is the side with the belts to the outside. We're going to need to make sure the belt on this side is also on the outside. So we want the fronts to be outside and outside, and the backs to be inside and inside. So that's what we are going to do next. Same process as we did before, right? So first step on this shaft, we're going to take our middle wheel with the 2 pulleys, find the metal hub, slide that side in all the way. And this time I think it's smarter if we had put this spacer on first. So we're going to do that this time first. Get that lined up. And again, I cannot push that in, so we are going back to using my 9/16 socket and the hammer. There we go. Oh, that one went in a little bit farther than the last one, but the last one pushed in the rest of the way later. All right, so this is for sure all the way in. It's looking good. And then same thing with the wheels. Let's actually mark the holes first so we don't get mixed up. Small hole diagonally down, small hole diagonally down. And so here's the difference. On the, oh wait, belts first, belts first. So our belt here, inside is back here. So this first belt I'm putting on the inside here needs to go towards the back of my robot here, or towards that side of my robot. The other belt then, when we put it on, is going to come this direction. All right, so we'll go ahead and do this wheel here. I think it's the front wheel since I'm here. And big spacer and wheel. Let's make sure we get that belt on. And then on the outside is the small spacer, and I will just get that nut started so we don't lose anything. Backside, we start with the small spacer. Get the wheel, get the belt on the wheel. Line it up, slide it through. Big spacer on this side. And now since we don't have that extra step, I'm just going to go straight to taking this off. Pushing the bearing in. Remember, we want the flat side up. Oh, this one needs the hammer. If you have to use the hammer, remember it's just light taps. We're not really trying to whack this one hard. All right, and let's get it lined up. Looks good. That bolt looks good. And once again, I'm going to lift up on those motors to get it to seat all the way. Perfect. Let's get that axle through. That axle's through. And let's get these nuts started. All right, back to the big 9/16 wrenches for this step. There it is. All right, we can do our churro bolts next. All right, and the last thing we have to do is now we have the corners here where we can add more regular bolts to hold the frame together. So mine stayed pretty lined up. If your holes don't line up, you might have to loosen your churro bolts and your wheel bolts a little bit to adjust this, but I think they should be pretty close, so we'll see. Let's grab those bolts. And we need our trusty 5/32 Allen wrench as well. And let's go for it. So we want to get one in back here. It'll go too. And if it's close to going, but it won't quite drop in, if you use the Allen wrench to screw it in, it will straighten everything up too when it finishes. So we'll start that one. Get a 3/8 wrench on the bottom to hold the nut. Remember, we should be starting on the not nylon side of the nut. Looks good. Let's just get all 4 bolts on the top, and then we'll flip it over and we will get all 4 bolts on the bottom. Okay, over to the other side. Wait, we need all right, that side's all good. Top side's all good. I'm going to flip my robot over. And now on the bottom, we've got 2 bolts that we want to try to get lined up. some back here. One more. Flip it around and get the other side. All right, we went through, got all those bolts tight, flipped it back over so it's on its wheels. Something you want to kind of check at this point is roll it back and forth and make sure it feels relatively free. You can also, kind of turn one of the wheels by hand. And if you feel anything like really getting stuck, then you might need to open up your transmissions and check again to see if there's any issues there. But this one is spinning nice and freely. So I think we're good on that. You might have noticed that we cut those churros earlier. These churros generally will go across the frame like this and bolt into place. But right now, they don't actually have a location in the Everybot. So we may need these later. We may not. Put them on a shelf, hang on to them just in case we need them. But other than that, we have finished our chassis. So awesome job with that, and we'll be back with you in the next video.